What does it mean to be human? This is a question that can be applied to any character in Jujutsu Kaisen, but one character in particular really takes this question and rakes the mind. That character would be Mechamaru. If you were to describe Mechamaru, you could quite literally call him a walking corpse. With that being said, it would really make you beg the question whether or not his life has any value in the slightest. The value of life is a very precious thing and is something that most people might just take for granted. Especially when you have some people born with better lives than others, with easier means, more possibilities to make things happen. Being born with potential to be great, while in some cases, you may be born with a life not worth living at all. And unfortunately, you could say this for Mechamaru, or more accurately, Kokichi Muda. With that being said, Mechamaru would have one of the most unfortunate circumstances in the series, with his body being completely destroyed and leaving him in a state where he has to be isolated and alone because his body is so weak and fragile. Being completely alone and stuck in a cave all his life, this really brings to question, how exactly does Mechamaru live? You see, he imposes his will on a mechanical puppet. This robot, so to speak, would be Mechamaru's lifeline as a student and as a sorcerer. Now, what exactly would have ruined his body to such a state that he wouldn't even be able to live his own life and he would have to send a robot to live it for him? While being born, he would be unlucky enough to go through heavenly restriction. And this would leave his body in the horrible state that it's currently in. And with that being said, his body would not even be able to withstand natural light. It would only get worse in Mechamaru's case because his right arm and both of his legs are completely useless and he has no feeling below his waist whatsoever. Back onto the topic of his skin, he can't even be in the dark. The moonlight will ruin his skin and it will make it feel like he's being poked by needles. How do you live? It's a simple question with a simple answer. You don't. And that's what makes Mechamaru's life so terrible. He was born with so many abilities and a bit of potential when it comes to the Jujutsu world, but outside of that, he has nothing really going for him and he realizes this. And unlike others, he would have a completely different set of values when it comes to Jujutsu as a whole. This power Mechamaru obtained would without a doubt be nothing more than a curse. So much so that he would hate it and throw his power in the trash without even thinking twice about it, because in Mechamaru's eyes, the most important thing is a regular life. Now, since he lives anything but a regular life, considering the fact that he's a Jujutsu sorcerer, this lets us wonder, how exactly does Mechamaru take down his kills? Without a doubt, Mechamaru is a genius and he would utilize his intellect in any combative situation. And his robot body is actually very clear proof of this. With one of his many ways to attack, he would use sword option, which allows his arm to turn into a blade. To be more accurate, he would get claws that could tear and shred his enemies apart. Not only that, but blades would come from his forearm, which really lets you understand what kind of a monster he can be at close combat, and with multiple combinations that this body can allow actually gives it some advantages over a human body. Letting Mechamaru move in abnormal ways, he would be able to have thrusters on the end of his elbows, which would give his arm a new sense of speed and force to deal with his enemies. Obviously, this really wouldn't be possible if he was using a human body, but he's able to also do an ultra spin attack, which allows his arm to twist and actually bend into the motion of a drill, which would definitely tear his enemy to shreds. What Mechamaru is capable of is actually unreal, and I don't think we've seen anyone this technologically advanced in the entire series. And these are just close range offensive options that he can use. When it comes to defense, he can use the Ultra Shield, which would block oncoming attacks, but would be able to also rebound and damage opponents that came into any contact with it due to its spikes. Mechamaru would even have some out of the ordinary ranged attacks, allowing him to shoot lasers out of his palms. The Ultra Cannon would have some of the most effective range for a projectile, and it would cover a huge amount of surface area, making it pretty difficult to dodge. And the ranged attacks really don't even stop here, because when he switches to mode Albatross, he can shoot a giant laser from his mouth, which incinerates everything in its path, leaving a whole forest in destruction and flames. He would even concentrate the same beam with his hands, so you can really only imagine what kind of destructive force is behind this attack. Mechamaru would even have more mobility options unlike most Jujutsu sorcerers because he can take advantage of the thrusters coming out of his elbows and make it so that he can get around his opponents in ways that most sorcerers really couldn't, because after all, you have to be a robot to have these kind of thrusters, and most people aren't robots, so they're not gonna move like this character. Mechamaru's potential as a sorcerer is actually in a different league because he can always just bring up another doll to fight for him, which means that he can live to fight another day every single battle because you won't actually be fighting his real body, which means that he actually has a very high survival rate and he's very expendable unlike most Jujutsu sorcerers. So realistically, Mechamaru can always come back to another fight and figure out what kind of powers and advantages he can have over an opponent without even making himself get hurt, allowing him to fight as reckless as he wants. Speaking of being reckless, he even has an entire army of mechanical dolls at his disposal, which can be used to overwhelm anyone in a fight. And if some way, somehow his robot army doesn't end up killing you, he can always pilot his giant mecha. Ultimate Mechamaru mode absolute, and with that being said, it has 17 years worth of cursed energy powering it. And with a year's worth of energy being used in one attack, it has enough power to easily destroy a bridge. Even then, Ultimate Mechamaru Absolute doesn't even need to use cursed energy to attack because he can always just physically hit you with the mecha's hands itself. And if he wants to, he can use Miracle Cannon, which costs 2 years worth of energy, but he will attack with both hands and create a shockwave around himself that will destroy anyone who is too close to him. His next move, Pigeon Viola, would create 5 orbs of cursed energy, which would fly at an opponent and home in on them, allowing each orb to curve in an attempt to hit whoever he's fighting. And not only that, this move would cost up to 5 years of cursed energy, letting you understand just how valuable an attack like this really is. Finally, one of his most impressive feats would be using Simple Domain in the form of a technique charge. Through Mechamaru's own genius, he was able to create and also process a simple domain technique and use it in his own attack and strategize by using these canisters sparingly, which is going to allow him to outsmart anyone he's fighting. These canisters would have enough destructive force to be able to destroy the soul. If Mechamaru were to fire this as a projectile, he would be able to kill his opponent very easily. And these charges also make it so that a domain expansion would not work on Mechamaru's mech. So he would be able to prevent an opponent from using a domain expansion 5 times, and that's if he doesn't want to mix it up and use these canisters as their own full-fledged attacks to destroy your soul. Not only can he shoot these same canisters at a distance, but he can also use it as a close-ranged attack by injecting these canisters into his opponents with a stab of his finger. The simple domain in these canisters immediately nullify a domain expansion, making it so that a domain expansion cannot be used in a fight whatsoever. When it comes to combat and smarts, Mechamaru is in his own league, and he's someone you would really never ever want to run into. After understanding his fighting style and abilities as a sorcerer, it makes you wonder, who is Mechamaru as a person? As I mentioned before, he is someone who has suffered from the negative effects of the heavenly restriction, making it so that he can hardly live his own life. Sadly enough, Mechamaru would actually have a lot in common with the outcast Toji Zenin, or more accurately, Toji Fushiguro, because as we would all know, Toji would suffer from the effects of the heavenly restriction. Just like Mechamaru, but their cases would actually end up being different. If we were to look at both of these guys, we'd know the clear difference. Toji's heavenly restriction allows him to have superhuman strength, enhanced 5 senses, and he would also possess no cursed energy. While Mechamaru's body would be completely destroyed, fragile, and he would have a lot of cursed energy, but he would be unable to even move in the sunlight, let alone the moonlight. Toji would be considered to have the apex of a superhuman life, while Mechamaru would have an abnormality that prevents him from living altogether. Even as I say this, Toji would be hated by the Jujutsu world because he does not have any cursed energy, and he would be the exact opposite of what the Jujutsu world would want. They would want someone with a cursed technique and not a human being that is so physically strong that he would be considered to be a monster. Toji would have no place in the Jujutsu world whatsoever, but Mechamaru would, because his curse techniques would actually be amplified due to his heavenly restriction. Mechamaru would be born with a technique that can be used over a wide range and would also be able to exceed the limits of cursed energy output, which would allow Mechamaru to have a lot of potential in the Jujutsu world. The heavenly restriction placed on Toji's body would prevent him from having a place in the Jujutsu world, while the heavenly restriction placed on Mechamaru's body would allow him to prosper in the Jujutsu world. Toji would have a body that would allow him to excel at living, while Mechamaru would have a body that would ultimately hold him back from living altogether. This is what makes the world of Jujutsu Kaisen so twisted, because the world of Jujutsu would value a husk who can hardly even live, but they would appreciate the very fact that he can kill and hunt curses in their own traditional values. While a man with superhuman abilities and strength would be seen as useless, simply because he does not possess cursed energy. The world of Jujutsu values the life of a husk over the life of a person who surpasses the human limits. Mechamaru would have a huge amount of potential in the Jujutsu world, while Toji would not. And this would simply be because the Jujutsu world does not care about how anyone feels. The Jujutsu world does not care about Mechamaru or Toji. Both of these characters would hate their lives. Toji as a superhuman would be looked at as an outcast, and he would be ultimately deemed as a monster, while Mechamaru would be looked at with a sense of pride and he would be celebrated. As I say this, both Toji and Mechamaru would be viewed as if they were monsters. Toji would be a monster because he would not be conventional to the Jujutsu world, while Mechamaru would consider himself a monster due to his ugly and terrifying appearance. Now, why would the world of Jujutsu hate one monster, then praise another? This is because Toji would go against the teachings and traditions of Jujutsu, while Mechamaru would carry these same traditions on his back. As we know, Toji would retain his love and pride for the Jujutsu world even though it rejects him. Yet in Mechamaru's case, even though he is loved and celebrated by the world of Jujutsu, he would love nothing more than to throw the Jujutsu world away and to be able to live a normal life. You see, that's the main difference between the two, because although heavenly restriction had cursed them in two different ways, the Jujutsu world would want to get rid of the guy who was born with superhuman strength and powers and no cursed energy, even if he has a love and pride for the world of Jujutsu. And they would prefer Mechamaru, who's a cripple and a husk who can barely live for himself, who hates and would rather have nothing to do with Jujutsu altogether. The world of Jujutsu would push away someone who loves and genuinely has a pride for its teachings just because they don't like the way he was born. Yet they love someone who can barely live and would throw away the Jujutsu world in a heartbeat. Toji would want what Mechamaru has, and Mechamaru would want what Toji has. Toji would want Mechamaru's acceptance in the Jujutsu world, while Mechamaru would want a normal body and a normal life just like Toji. Simply put, Mechamaru is an embodiment of everything that the Jujutsu world is. And this is all because Mechamaru has one thing, one clear emotion that runs through his body: hatred. He would hate his own body, he would hate how others can live, and he would hate his abilities that he was cursed with, leaving him to be stronger than your average sorcerer, because as we already know, the world of Jujutsu works off of negative emotions, and his powers, his hatred, his anger, on top of his jealousy for other people, would only make his abilities and his cursed energy stronger. Mechamaru's hatred for the Jujutsu world is the exact reason as to why he fulfills such a big role in the Jujutsu world. Because Mechamaru hates the Jujutsu world, it makes him the perfect slave to it. Jujutsu itself would feed off of Mechamaru's negative emotions, which is why he is so accepted. Oddly enough, unlike Toji, Mechamaru wouldn't be the only person that would be widely accepted across the Jujutsu world. That person being Panda. Mechamaru and Panda are not your conventional Jujutsu sorcerers, and you can tell this just by looking at them. Just like with the Toji comparison, they would also be monsters. Unlike Toji, you would end up questioning Panda's and Mechamaru's humanity. Which makes you wonder, are Mechamaru and Panda really even human? Without a doubt, Mechamaru is, because we know that he has a human body, however he's controlling a mechanical doll with his abilities. So without a doubt, we know that he's a human, but that creates a fine line where it comes to Panda as a character. Is he really human, and whether or not he should be treated as one? When it comes to Mechamaru, he would look at Panda in jealousy and disgust because he can actually hang around people and form human bonds and relationships, even though he's anything but that. Human. While Mechamaru has to sit alone and abandoned in a room where he can't function his body and he has to impose his will on a doll. Why should a random corpse be having the rights that Mechamaru should have been born with to begin with? That's what makes you understand why Mechamaru has so much hatred for Panda at first. Why should a panda be able to walk around and live as a human when Mechamaru, a full-fledged human, isn't even able to do that? Panda is a non-human living as a human, while Mechamaru is a human living as a non-human, which is really what separates both of these characters, which allows you to understand more of Mechamaru's rage and, unfortunately, even his sadness. Throughout this fight, he continues to call Panda a doll, which is simply Mechamaru projecting his hatred on the panda, because without a doubt, Mechamaru would be this same doll that he hates, because he hates himself. And he would try to spread his own personal doubts onto Panda. Mechamaru would be a mechanical doll, a mechanical puppet on strings, enacting the will of Jujutsu as a whole, with no life of his own, while Panda would be able to live in peace and prosperity. Mechamaru's existence as a whole is a sad one, especially when you take into the fact that he is a human being. With that being said, Panda would not have these same human expressions of hatred and sadness, because he would never feel jealousy over humans. See, this is the biggest difference between Mechamaru and Panda. Panda was given a life, while Mechamaru had a life that was taken from him. Which lets us understand Mechamaru's hatred, understand his sorrow, understand the reason why he wants a body so much. He is a human with human emotions who can't even express anything else except for his hatred. Without a doubt, everything was taken from him at birth. Toji would be born with a curse on his body from heavenly restriction. Panda would be born and be cursed to live inside of a panda's body for the rest of his life, while Mechamaru would be cursed to live a life where he cannot have anything, let alone experience the bare minimum of living. What kind of existence is that except for the existence of a doll, a tool to be used by the Jujutsu world? The only thing that would keep him pushing, that wasn't a hatred for himself, a hatred for his body, the anger that he would possess for Jujutsu in the way he was born, would be the very fact that he loved Miwa. This would be the only thing that wouldn't be a negative emotion, a feeling that would only take everything away from him. He would cling on to a feeling of positive energy. And this feeling and this desire would ultimately kill him in the end, because he would end up going against Jujutsu and the will of what it means to be a Jujutsu sorcerer. Rather than continuing to live on as a puppet and clinging to his hatred, he would pay the price for loving Miwa and ultimately die for doing so. With his last wish being, his last desire would be for Miwa to find her own happiness. All Mechamaru wanted to do was get closer to the ones he loved and the woman he cherished most, Miwa. But ultimately trying to get closer only pulled him further away from these things. Mechamaru would want Miwa to be happy in the end of it all. Can she really be happy in a life without him? In Mechamaru's foolish attempts at finally living a life of a normal human being, getting the opportunity to finally hold the ones he loved close with human flesh and blood, without even realizing, he would throw away his day-to-day life as a human and Jujutsu sorcerer for an uncertainty of his own value. Unlike Toji, who had suffered from the heavenly restriction, yet still have a body of human flesh and blood, only to get exiled from the Jujutsu world, in Mechamaru's eyes, Toji would at least still be human, even if Toji was exiled from the Jujutsu world. While Mechamaru would be given a corpse to live in, and he would be accepted by the Jujutsu world, and it makes you really wonder whether or not the world of Jujutsu was really worth the bare minimum of living. Is acceptance of the Jujutsu world even really all that worth it? It makes you wonder whether or not Toji or Maki even have a place to complain, because Mechamaru doesn't even have a life to live, even if he's accepted by the Jujutsu world. Coming to terms with a panda with both Mechamaru and a cursed corpse having a lot more in common than he would actually want, with both of them essentially being cursed corpses walking, and have Mechamaru question his self-worth. In the end, he would try and fight for his own humanity. In doing so, he would only end up throwing that very thing away. Mechamaru didn't see the value in his life, even if he was a slave, even if he was a hate-filled killing machine. He couldn't understand just how much he meant to people, regardless of whether or not he was a human living a normal life. When he finally realized this, it was already too late. Even the most subtle and bare minimums of living have some type of worth.